Hey developers, welcome again to the programming fields. I'm back with another featured video in Livewire 3 playlist. This comprehensive guide is on Livewire 3 lifecycle methods. I'm Umesh Rana and today we will be diving deep into how Livewire manages its component lifecycle. Understanding these methods can greatly enhance your ability to build dynamic and responsive applications with Laravel. Livewire components have several lifecycle methods that you can hook into. These methods are similar to those you might find in JavaScript frameworks or libraries. But before diving into the Livewire lifecycle methods, let's understand what exactly lifecycle methods are. So, lifecycle methods in the context of software development refer to the predefined methods or functions which are automatically invoked at specific points during the execution or lifecycle of an application or component. These methods allow developers to hook into various stages of the life cycle to perform initialization, cleanup, state management, and other actions. So in the context of web development, lifecycle methods typically include initialization, update, rendering, and unmounting. So in the initialization phase, the methods called when a component or page is firstly created or mounted. In the update phase, the methods will be called when state or data changes within the component. And in the rendering phase, the methods will be called when the component is about to render or has finished rendering. And in the unmounting, the component states will be cleaned up. So let's go through each of them with examples. So I already have one fresh setup of Laravel 11 application and I already installed Livewire. So before moving to the practical example, let's head over to the official documentation of Livewire 3 and inside this you will see lifecycle hooks. So let's click on this and here you will have the lifecycle methods. So Livewire provides these all lifecycle methods as mount, hydrate, boot, updating, updated, rendering, rendered, dehydrate and exception. Alright. So these all lifecycle methods will be executed along with the components. We will see the usage of these all methods in the Livewire 3 here. So firstly, let's create a fresh component here. So let's navigate to the terminal and here let's create component as PHP artisan make Livewire and we will have to pass the component name. So I will pass the component name as counter. Let's hit enter and yes, it created first component as counter. Let's come to the VS Code editor and here inside this app we have the folder as Livewire and inside this we have the counter class, and by default this counter component contains render method, and inside this render method this included view as livewire.counter. So if you will check out the resources and views folder, inside this we have the Livewire folder and we have the counter.blade.php. Alright, now firstly we will have to render the counter component. So what I will do, I will render this counter component in the welcome blade. So inside this welcome blade, I will do cleanup and here I will remove this from here and this footer as well. This header is fine. If I will refresh it, yes, we have the Laravel logo only. And also if you don't want this background color, we can remove these all. Yes, we have the black background. We can remove this dark beige black and text white class. These are not required. Yes, if we'll refresh, yeah, we have the empty view here. Also, we can remove these styles. These are not required. Alright. Now inside this, I will include Livewire styles and Livewire script. So we will have to include Livewire styles. Alright, and just before this closing of body tag, we will have to include Livewire scripts. Now if you'll refresh and if you'll open this page source, then here we can see we have the Livewire styles included and we have the Livewire script. Now we will be able to render our Livewire component inside this blade. So inside this body tag, we will have to include our Livewire component. So I will call Livewire counter. We have the counter component. Alright, now let's come inside this counter component and here let's add any text. So inside h1 tag, I will add, hey, this is Livewire 3 counter component. Now let's come to the browser. Let's refresh, and yes, our counter component has been rendered here. Now let's start implementing the lifecycle hooks inside this component. So very first, we will start with mount method. So inside this counter class, by default, we have the render method. So this render method is also a lifecycle method that we will come to this later. So firstly, we will work with mount method. So basically, the mount method will be called when the component will be initialized very first time. So the mount method will be invoked or initialized when your component is created. Alright, if we'll check out the documentation under this mount, we can see this is just similar to constructor. So generally in PHP class, we have the constructor as construct method. So this constructor method will be executed automatically when any object of that class has been created or when that class has been invoked. So similar to the constructor, Livewire provides mount method. So basically, when our component will be invoked first time, this mount method will be executed. So this mount method will be helpful to initialize the property, and also this can be used to capture the data from the parent component. And similarly, this can be helpful to capture the route parameters as well. So let's implement this mount method first. So inside this class, I will create mount method. But before creating this mount method, I will define one public variable as $count. Alright. So in Livewire, we already know we can access any public variable or property directly in the Livewire component view. So in the component blade file, we can directly render that count variable just like this. And by default, I have not initialized any value. So previously we initialized count value just like this, and if we'll refresh this, then you will have the count value. Alright, but this is not a good approach to initialize the value of count by default like this. So instead of doing this, we will use mount method. So we will have to define public function mount. So this mount method will be executed when we will render this component. So let's suppose if I will put echo here, hey, this is mount method. Alright, if we'll refresh it, then we can see this mount method is executed before this component. Here we added this message inside this component view, but this mount method is executed before this component. Alright, it does not matter if you will put this mount method just below this render. Okay, let's save and come back to the browser. Let's refresh. The result is same. It does not depend on the order of methods defined here. I will keep it here just for now, and inside this mount method, I will initialize or reinitialize this count variable. So by default, we set this count to 1. Now let's suppose I want to initialize this count with 2. So here this will override the previous value of count from 1 to 2. Let's check it. Yes, we can say this overridden the previous value of count. Alright. If you will remove this initial value of count is 1, and if you will refresh it again, the value will be same. Okay. So this is the use of mount here. Now we will see how we can receive any props in this component. So inside this welcome view, we have rendered this counter component. So in some cases, if you want to pass any props or any data through this counter component and you want to receive it here and you want to render this to counter view, then how you will be able to do this? So Livewire provides the flexibility to pass the props in the component as well. So here to pass the props, you will have to define the colon and the property name. Let's suppose I want to pass any message. So inside this, we can pass any static message or we can pass any variable directly here. So if I want to pass any static message, just like any string, then we will have to wrap that message in the double quote and single quote pair. And here you will have to pass the message as, hey, this is greeting message. And now inside this counter component, we will have to receive this message. So let's come to the counter class, and here you will have to define one variable as public $message. Now inside this mount method, we will have to receive this props that is passed from this welcome view. We will have to define the variable as $message. So this message variable should be same as we have passed here as a key inside this counter component. Okay. Now in order to use this $message variable inside this counter blade, we will have to assign this $message to this public $message property. So we will assign this to $message equals $message. All right. Now we will be able to access this $message variable directly inside this counter. So we can write $message. Let's save and come to the browser. Let's refresh, and yes, we are able to access this message here. Here we can put it inside any div. Okay. Similarly, if you want to render this counter component inside a route directly, so let's suppose inside this routes web.php, I will create another route as route : get counter, and inside this counter I will call that Livewire component class. So we will have to call counter : class. All right. So if you will try to access this counter URL in the browser, let me duplicate this, and here let's try to access this counter. So here it said the $message property is undefined. That means we tried to receive the message variable inside this mount, but we are not receiving any message from this route. All right. So by default, we can keep it null just like this. So this is optional here. So if we will not pass any parameter from this route, then it will work. Let's refresh. Yes, this is working. So now we will see how we can pass any parameter through route, because this mount method will be helpful to receive parameters from route as well. So in some cases, when you are creating any CRUD application kind of thing, then in that case, based on the given ID or given parameter, you perform some operations. So here in the route, we can pass parameter just like this. All right. And here let's receive another argument just like $id, and again I will initialize this with null. Okay. And here we can add dump to display this parameter as $id. All right. Now come to the browser. Let's refresh this. Now this said this route is not found. That means the definition has been changed for this route as counter/something, and from this URL in the browser we have not passed any parameter. So let's try to pass any value 3. Let's hit enter, and yes, we are able to access that route parameter. Similarly, we can pass this route parameter to the view as well, and in that case you will have to define this ID as a public here. All right. So this is the use of mount lifecycle method in Livewire. Now let's come to the documentation again, and here we will discuss about next method as hydrate. So in the description, it clearly mentioned this method will be called when a component is rehydrated at the beginning of the subsequent request. So this will be helpful for preparing the component states, that means component data, each time when the component is loaded or reloaded. Alright, so let's try to understand this component lifecycle hydrate method. So let's come to the VS Code editor, and inside this class, I will define one more method as hydrate. And inside this hydrate method, firstly I will add one dump as hydrate method. Alright, and if you will try to run this component again, you won't see any changes here. So let's come to the browser, let's refresh, and you can see there is no change reflecting here. So in order to understand this hydrate method, firstly let's create one button here inside this counter component, so that our component will be reloaded or loaded when we will click on the button. So here inside this button, I will add one text as increment, and inside this button I will bind one on click as wire : click, and here I will define one click method as increment. Now let's copy this increment method first, and here just below the hydrate let's define this increment method. And on increment, I want to increase the count value by 1. So we already initialized this count value as 2 inside this mount method. Now inside this increment, I will increment this by 1. Alright, let's come to the browser. Let's refresh it. Yes, we have the increment button here. Now let's try to increment. Yes. So when we clicked on increment, we can see this triggered this hydrate method. That means when our component is reloaded, this will invoke this hydrate method. Alright, let's try to click again. Yes, every time when you perform any click, that means when our component is loaded or reloaded, this will trigger the hydrate method. Alright, so inside this hydrate method, we can set a condition just like if $this count equals, let's suppose 5. That means the initial value of count will be 2, but when we will increment this using this increment button, this will increment by 1, and when this count value will reach to 5, I want to reset this to 0, just like this. Alright, let's see the magic. Let's refresh. So the initial value of count is 2. Now let's try to increment. So this is 3, we have 4, and we have 5. Alright, so now the count is reached to 5. So now next, if I will try to click on this increment, this will reset the value from this 5 to 0, and this will increment that 0 to 1. Let's try to click on this increment again. Yes, we can see before incrementing, this reset the count value to 0. Alright, so to understand this better, let's add count here inside this hydrate dump. Okay, now let's refresh it again. Let's click. Yeah, so before incrementing, we had the count value as 2, and here we are getting this incremented value. Now let's click on this again. The incremented value is 4, and before incrementing it was 3. Yes, now the incremented value is 5, and here before incrementing it was 4. Now let's click on this increment again. Yes, so here before incrementing, when the counter reached to 5, this count is reset to 0, and here we are getting this incremented value by 1. So here this is the use of hydrate method. When your component will be loaded or reloaded, this will trigger the hydrate method. Let's comment this dump for now, and let's come to the documentation again. And now next we will see this boot method. So this boot method functionality is similar to this mount method. So if you scroll down, inside this boot, it will render only 1 when the component is loaded, and inside this boot method we can initialize the protected property. So let's try to understand this using example. So let's come to the VS Code editor, and after this hydrate, let me define one function as boot. So this boot method will be loaded when the component has been rendered, or you can say when the component has been booted. So this will render the first time only when the component has been booted, and it will execute it only once. So let's try to understand. So firstly, I will add one dump here as boot method. Let's save, come to the browser, let's refresh, and yes, we can see this boot method has been loaded just before this mount. Alright, and inside this boot method, let's try to display this count value, and that's initial value is null. We can see, let's refresh, and yes, we can see the initial value of count is null. That means this boot method will be executed before this mount method. So first time this will be loaded at only once, and if you want to set count value here, just like $this count is equals 10, and here before resetting this count to 2, I will add again dump here as count inside mount, and here I will concat and I will print as $this count. Okay, let's refresh. Yes, we can see the initial value of count is null, and we set the count value to 10 inside the boot method, just like this. and we displayed this count inside mount method again. So inside this mount method, we are getting the count value as 10, as we can see here. But after resetting the count inside this mount method, the final value of count is getting 2 inside this blade when it is rendered. So let's understand this. So here inside this counter, we have created this public count variable. When the component has been booted, this will trigger the first method as boot, and inside this boot method, the initial count value is null, as we have not initialized any value here, and inside this boot we have set this count value to 10. So after this boot method, this will trigger this mount method, and inside this mount method, the incremented value of count is 10, that is coming from this boot method, and again this count value is reassigning to 2 when this mount method is executed. Alright, so the final value of this count will be 2 because at the last moment inside this mount it is reinitialized, and inside this render this will return the final value as 2 of this count. So this is the use of boot method here. I will add comment as boot method. This is hydrate method, this is mount method, and this is the render method. Now let's come to the documentation again, and let's hook up into the next component lifecycle. So after this boot, we have the updating method. So this updating method will be triggered just before when any component property is being updated. So let's understand this using example again. So let's come to the VS Code editor, and here before implementing this updating lifecycle hook method, we will have to define an input field so that from there we can update this public property count or message. So basically this updating method will be triggered when any public property is being updated. So inside this counter component, let's define one input field. So we will create input type as text. Alright, and I will pass name attribute, let's suppose username, and here I will bind this input event so that when we will type anything, through that we can capture the entered value. So Livewire provides wire model directive, and inside this we will have to define the field name, through that we can bind this input. So I will pass the name as, let's suppose, username, and inside this counter component I will define one more public property as username. Let's come to the browser, let's refresh, and yes, we have the input field. Now we will have to use this username property inside updating method. So I will pass username and I will add dump username here. Alright, now let's come back to the browser again, let's refresh, let's type anything, and let's try to click on this increment. Yes, so when we clicked on this increment, this triggered this updating method. So as of now we can comment this boot method dump here. We already added that dump inside boot method as well. Okay, so let me comment this, let's refresh, let's type anything, and let's try to click on this increment. Yes, so here we are getting the input field name as attribute that is going to be updated. This updating method accepts two parameters. First will be the property name, that is input name, and the second will be value. If we'll check out the Livewire documentation again, then inside this updating method, then we can see it accepts two parameters. First will be property that we are going to update, and the second will be value of that property. So let's add one more parameter here as value, and let's add in dump here. Let's come to the browser again, let's refresh, let's try to enter any name, and let's click on increment. Yes, so the first parameter is username, that is the name of that attribute, and the second parameter is basically a value that is entered inside this input field. So this is the use of this updating method. This will be triggered when you want to update any public property. Now let's come to the documentation again, and we will look into the next hook. So after updating, we have the updated method. So this method will be triggered when any property has been updated. So the difference between updating and updated is updating method will be triggered before the component property is being updated, and the updated method will be triggered after the component property has been updated. So we will have to define one more function here, and let's create function as updated, and this updated function will take parameter as property, and let's dump this property as username here. So let's save and let's come to the browser again. Let's refresh. Let's try to enter anything. Let's click on this. We can see along with this updating method, this triggered updated method as well. So firstly it triggered updating method, and once the value has been updated, it triggered this updated method. If we'll try to change this order of sequence, then it won't impact anything. Let's refresh. Let's update it again. Yes, we can see again it triggered the same result. So this is the use of updating and updated lifecycle hook methods. Now let's come back to the documentation again and let's check the other. Now next we have the rendering lifecycle hook. So as it is mentioned here, this will be triggered before the render method. So inside this component class, we can see we already have render method by default, and this render method is used to render the component view. So if you want to update anything just before rendering to the view, then you can use this rendering lifecycle hook method. So let's define rendering, and inside this rendering function, let's add dump again as rendering view. Let's come to the browser again. Let's refresh, and yes, we can see we have the rendering view executed. So after this rendering, this will trigger this render method. So let's suppose if I will add dump here as render method. So let's save it and let's come to the browser to check when this method will be executed. Let's refresh. So here it executed the render method first and then it executed the rendering. Inside the rendering lifecycle, we have one more method as rendered. So if we'll check out the documentation for this, then we can see we have the rendered method. So this will be executed after the view is rendered. So let's define this function as well. Public function rendered. Let's add dump again. View is rendered. Let's refresh this page, and yes, we can see this executed after this rendering function. Livewire provides one more lifecycle methods to clean up the state of the component. So if we'll scroll up and check the hydrate and dehydrate function, yeah, here we have the dehydrate. So this dehydrate function will be called at the end of this component request. So the dehydrate method is called before the component's state is serialized and sent to the front end. That means before Livewire saves the component state, this is important to finalize or clean up your component's data before sending it to the front end. So we can say this will be useful for the last minute adjustment of the component data. So let's understand this using example. So let's come to the VS Code editor. So here I will define one more function as public function dehydrate. Inside this dehydrate, again I will use dump, and inside this I will print this $this count. Dehydrate function, and this was our rendered function. Okay, this is done. Let's come to the browser again. Let's refresh. Yes, we can see this is dehydrate function executed here before sending the data to the front end. Inside this, we can update anything, just like $this count equals 22. Alright, let's refresh it, and yes, we can say the initial value of the count was 2, but inside the dehydrate we set it to 22. Alright, so this is all about component lifecycle hooks in Livewire. To recap, we have covered all key Livewire lifecycle methods and built a basic practical application. Mastering these methods will make your Livewire components more efficient and powerful. The lifecycle methods provide a structured way to manage the behavior of components lifecycle from initialization to rendering and cleanup. They are integral to building robust and efficient applications, and they ensures that components behave predictably and can be extended or customized as needed. So don't be afraid to experiment with these methods in Livewire 3. They are very powerful tools in your Livewire toolkit. If you have any questions or need further assistance, feel free to leave a comment below. So thanks for watching. If you found this video helpful, please like, share and subscribe for more tutorials like this. And don't forget to check out the links in the description for related videos and resources. So see you in the next video. Until then, happy coding.